Hello and most welcome to 1088 of the Heidegger series, and today we will dwell a little deeper into Heraclitus' thinking and to compare what are the implications of this rather tremendous project of Heraclitus. He saves both his parody or paradoxical handling of the Milesians, saves both physis and language, whereas ordinary language, or the simplification of language as an idea that language is nothing peculiar, you take away all the small details in language, you make it cruder, crueler, less thinking, less understanding, you skip the details, you only have this very coarse take on language, this oversimplification. That will in itself pair badly with the world, with physis as well. Both will be out of shape. This is the modern language, where we don't put any precision into how we use the words. We are sloppy, just as our sloppy handwriting, without details, without precision, without awareness, without direction and focusing. We put very little detail into how we say things. So it is not an ideology, that one of Saussure, for instance, an idea that Derrida for some reason thought was an idea, an ideology, metaphysics of presence. I would say it's just sheer sloppiness, not caring about language. Then they turn into just oppositions, and they seem to be coming from the outside, not from the inside. It's a horrific view on language. Obviously it's a rape on language to say such a thing, but it's also, as Heraclitus shows, it is a destruction in the crudest word of physis also. Because all details disappears, all depth of reality disappears. We become hardened, we become less delicate, we become less feeling. When I say feeling, I don't mean emotional, I mean in the strictest sense rational thinking. Lack of presence, this is what haunts modern man more than anything else. When we don't put any effort into what we are saying anymore, when we can't see the nice peculiarities of our own language, which are not similar to the peculiarities in other languages, for instance, we lose the finer details, we lose the ability to understand in a profound, deep way. So it's quite a thing that Heraclitus started. I will continue from the book. I found a fitting chapter here in the commentary, and it's the book of Charles H Kahn, which I started the other day. This is at page 208. Maybe the most famous sight of them all, famous quote from Heraclitus: "War is father of all, and king of all, and some he has shown as gods, others men. Some he had made slaves, others free." Let that sink in. The doctrine of opposition is here restated in even more dramatic and more puzzling form. How can war, the typical cause of death and destruction, be the universal father responsible for birth and life? And if it is clear how warfare can account for the distinction between free men and slaves. In what sense does it fix a distinction between men and gods? The resolution of both puzzles turn out to be the ambiguity between war in the literal sense and Heraclitus' use of the term for a universal principle of opposition. It is the second notion that is personified here in the phrase Father of all and King of all, echoing the Homeric formula for Zeus, Father of men and gods. The term panton, of all, is ambiguous, as elsewhere, between personal and neuter form, so that war is presented as father not only of gods and men like Zeus, but of all things that come to pass, ginomena panta. And the phrase king of all persons or things is not formulaic, hence even more emphatic here. Thus, war figures not merely as a substitute for Zeus, but a kind of super Zeus, like the Divine One. An assimilation to Zeus is also suggested by the word edexe. He has shown some gods, some as men, which recalls the typical signal of Zeus' governance, when he gives an omen on high, showing a sign of his favor or ill will. This personification of the chief cosmic principle in terms of imagery normally associated with the king of the gods prepares and explains the announcement that the wise one alone is unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus. As long as war is understood in this general sense, there is no difficulty in seeing how it is responsible for mortality and divinity, slavery and freedom. Since it is, by definition, the decisive plan or causal factor in everything that comes to pass. It remains to be seen whether another coherent interpretation can be given by taking polemos literally throughout as ordinary combat. There is no problem with the freedom-slavery distinction in this reading. But what sense can we make of war showing or designating gods as well as men? Gigon thought that the reference must be to death in the battle. Those who survive remain men, those who fall are raised to the condition of deity. Insofar as this question concerns the fate of human beings after death, it will be dealt with below. By contrast with this phrase, the apotheosis of war in another quote is distinguished by its vivid personification and sharper focusing on the destiny of mankind. The human condition is defined by a double set of oppositions. The internal antithesis between free and servile status, the most radical contrast conceivable in ancient society. Let me put in another parenthesis. Wave and particle are, without a doubt, the most radical contrast in reality, but it's not a factor of physics. It is part of language, therefore it counts. Very important to understand that, and Heraclitus already 400-500 before Christ made that point. And external contrast between men and gods, as in the traditional conception of human beings as mortal earthlings. The parallel may suggest that just as freedom and slavery are alternative, sometimes successive conditions for the same beings, so humanity and divinity are alternative, even alternating states which, like day and night, war and peace, life and death, define by their opposition and succession the full dimensions of human existence. Sorry, I need to blow my nose. It's a bit chilly here. Sorry about that. So humanity and divinity are alternative, even alternating states by which, like day and night, war and peace, life and death, defined by their opposition and succession, the full dimension of human existence. Recall another quote, "War is common, the killer gets killed, and he who conquers one day may be vanquished in the next." It is just such an equivalence in succession that we find in mortals are immortals and immortals mortals. Before turning to text dealing with the afterlife, we may sum up the doctrine articulated previously. These fragments list pairs of opposition of different kinds, which are all in some sense anthropocentric, in that the opposing terms correspond to two contrasting human experiences, two states of concepts governing human life, justice and injustice, slave and free, the contrast between human response and that of another species, some tension characterizing human activity, or an opposition between the human and the divine, or the human lack of insight or insight. Other fragments presents a different range of opposition, more properly described as cosmic, in that the relevant contrast does not depend in any essential way upon the existence of human beings. Night and day, cold, warm, moist, dry, fire, sea, sea, earth, sea, prester, winter, summer. The cosmic fragments are full of cosmic antitheses, and nearly all of these may be thought of as manifestations of the kindling and quenching of universal fire. Now it would be tedious to attempt to catalogue of all examples of polar contrast or oppositions. There is scarcely a text of Heraclitus that would not have to be included. The pattern of antithesis structure his whole work. just as it structures the reality he's trying to describe. In this sense, the doctrine of opposites, like the thesis of unity, which is its counterpart, is coextensive with Heraclitus' thought as a whole. Perhaps the only generalization which applies in every case is that the opposition between the terms is obvious, where some insight is required to grasp the harmonie binding them together. And this insight will generally involve recognition of a positive role for what is prima facie a negative term. At the very least, the negative term functions as a point of contrast, by reference to which the positive contrary is made conceptually definite and distinct. But the link between the two is never merely conceptual. My distinction, that is Kant's, between anthropocentric and cosmic oppositions is somewhat artificial, since by allusion or direct juxtaposition, Heraclitus will insist upon the connection between these two sets of terms. But the distinction has the merit of focusing attention upon the crucial antithesis between life and death, formulated in the riddle of the bow and developing the theory of the psyche. This topic of life and death lies at the very point of contact or fitting together of the cosmic and anthropocentric dimensions in Heraclitus' thought. We have a couple of quotes here. I just call them by the last number. 4 from D72, 27. So, what awaits men at death they do not expect or even imagine. D28A, the great man is eminent in imagining things, and on this he hangs his reputation for knowing it all. 86, incredibility escapes recognition. Justice will catch up with those who invent lies and those who swear to them. Start with number 4 here, the first one I read. Announces a new doctrine of human destiny after death. It raises the curtain on what we might call Heraclitus' eschatology, the doctrine of the end or endlessness of human life. But for the moment, the curtain raises on a bare stage. It is only with the parallel between death and sleep in 9 and 90 that Heraclitus gives us some hint of his own conception of what awaits us when we die. The two verbs that express man's ignorance is elopontai or dukeosin. They are suggestive but ambiguous. El pontai, what they expect, can also mean what they hope for. It is the fate in store for us better than our fondest hopes, or worse than our grimmest expectations? The point of this site is that we do not know, and the choice of words is thus not designed to give us any further clues. The verb el pontai may recall another remark. He who does not expect will not find out the unexpected, anel piston, for it is trackless and unexplored. This echo would indicate that the inquiry or search for wisdom will not be completed until it has resolved the riddle of death. The verb dokousin, they do not imagine, contains another echo of the fragments on human ignorance. Most men do not recognize gynokosin, what they experience, but they believe their own opinions. Heotosi dokusi, or doxi. The self-delusion of man in the face of death is a piece with a complacent failure of insight that characterizes their life throughout. Oh, good. The theme of seeming, imagination, or opinion, represented by the verb dukein, provides the historical root for the metaphysical distinction between appearance and reality. This distinction was first systematically drawn in the poem of Parmenides, where divine cognition, knowing, and truth are contrasted with the mortal opinions, doxa, in which there is no true trust, pistis. But before Parmenides and before Heraclitus, Xenophanes had denied that a man can have a clear vision or a certain knowledge of the most important matters, and insisted that we must be satisfied with guesswork, dokos, or with opinion like unto truth, dedoxasto. Thus, Duquesne invokes the notion of a typically human and typically fallible type of cognition. This same notion of Duquesne or guesswork is taken up and played upon another phrase, 525, where the eminence of the man who enjoys public recognition and approval, or docimutatos, is contrasted with the shabby credentials of what he himself recognizes and accepts, doceonta, mere seeming or imagining. The thematic resonance of dokusin in 534 and 535, together with the context of the second quotation in Clement, suggests that 535 also implies some reference to the mystery of the afterlife. Sorry about that. If so, the great man of general esteem will be some supposed expert on the afterlife, like Pythagoras. There is not much to be made of the brief and enigmatic 536. I include it in this context because of the play of Gynoskein, a possible echo of 535, and because our sources, Plutarch and Clement, both take apistia, incredulity or incredibility, in a sense relevant to the mysteries of death and afterlife. For Plutarch, the reference is to ta thea, divine or supernatural matters. It is because the truth in these matters is so strange and difficult to credit that they succeed in escaping our recognition. Finally, 537 announces that justice will catch up with inventors of lies and those who testify on their behalf. The role of Dyke here in regard to human transgressor recalls that of 494, D94, where she, with her ministers the Furies, watches to see that the sun does not exceed his measures. The parallel between cosmic order and human situation is what we had come to expect. What is more surprising is the focus on lies and false testimony as the crimes calling out for punishment. This is the only reference in the fragments to falsehood as such, as distinct from ignorance and lack of understanding. The closest parallel to this charge of fabricating lies in the accusation of artful knavery and imposture directed at Pythagoras. Hence, it's natural to suppose that it is not the poets and the wise men generally, but Pythagoras and his like, the solemn mystifiers and specialists on the fate of the soul after death, whom Heraclitus has in mind here. We are left wondering how Dike will take retribution. Heraclitus is relying upon the traditional Greek feeling that for great wrongdoings, adikemata, there are great punishments sent by the gods. But our text does not tell us where the punishment will come in this life or the next. And here's a cite from D96. Corpses should be thrown out quicker than dung. No utterance of Heraclitus is better calculated to offend the normal religious sensitivities of ancient Greek than this contempt for the cult of the dead, as every reader of the Antigone will recognize. The shock effect of this aphorism made it one of the best known throughout antiquity. Even Heraclitus' mockery of purification rites and temple worship does not touch such deep feelings of piety as this attack on the usual forms of ritual respect for the dead. Older than the cults of the city and closer to every human being's sense of his own vulnerability, the mourning and the burial of a kinsman represent the most fundamental stratum of ancient religion. If Heraclitus chooses to mock it in this extravagant way, that may be because he touches here on the nerve center of his own preoccupations, because he wishes to provoke us into an appreciation of the radical insight which his predecessors have missed. Ordinary cult practice and abstruse doctrine on the afterlife are equally remote from true understanding. But behind his provocative character, the statement itself remains enigmatic. And here I have a sudden realization, if I dare to put this into this context. I was actually exposed early on in life by Heraclitus, but in the translation of Beck Yoga Yogson, a Stockholm Swedish guy who translated Heraclitus for himself. But for him, Heraclitus was a revolutionary or an admirer of oppositions. This does not seem to be correct anymore. So, still, you can learn something new. This is mostly interesting. Now, Heraclitus grows from somebody who really wants to say something to someone who managed to say something, maybe apart from any other thinker at all in humanity until recent times. Perhaps there is some allusion to the return of the dead body to earth and its contribution by way of its own decay to the renewal of life from the soil. Still, the comparison is scarcely flattering. It suggests that what awaits man at death is what awaits their excrement and the offal of the farm animals. For Heraclitus, any other sense to death and any other continuation of life must be concerned not with the corpse, but with the element that has abandoned it, the psyche or life spirit. And here we have one from D21. Death is all things we see awake. All we see asleep is sleep. I have placed this carefully constructed sentence at the climax of Heraclitus's riddling, the darkest moment following on a succession of other mysteries. War distinguishing gods and men, justice apprehending liars, the surprise of death, corpses thrown out like dung, that have not yet been resolved. The sentence opened with the promise of a decisive clarification, a definition of death, whose scope is surprisingly general, all we can see, but the restriction to when we are awake is puzzling, and the next clause frustrates any hope of clear information. Since sleep and waking are opposite states, if what we see awake is death, then what we see asleep should be life, or so the symmetry of the clause leads us to expect. But when we reach the last word, we find not life, but sleep. Does Heraclitus mean, after all, to identify life with a private, half-conscious phantom experience of the dream world? Apparently not. And that is why the sentence does not end as symmetry would require. Why then does the deliberately arouse our expectation in this misleading way? Until we know the life until we know what life is, we cannot understand the definition of death. What does it exclude? And since much of what we see awake is alive in ordinary sense, in what extraordinary sense does death include this visible realm of living plants and animals? man strikes haptetai, a light for himself in the night, when his sight is quenched. Living he touches haptetai, the dead in his sleep. Waking he touches haptetai, the sleeper. Here the word play on haptetai and apos bestis, the two terms for the kindling and quenching of ever-living fire in D30, offers an initial clue for drawing together the cosmology and anthropology of Heraclitus into a unified vision of life and death. It is the phenomena of sleep and dreaming that may initiate us into these mysteries. We have seen that one aspect of what awaits man at death can be understood by attending to the fate of corpses, which, like dung, are reabsorbed into new life and vegetation by regression to more elementary forms. As Eliot put it, the earth is flesh, fur and feces. Human beings, like plants and animals, are ever living inasmuch as their bodies pass into the unending cycle of elemental transformation, which is the cycle of life. This emergence of all bodily forms from the perishing of what has gone before seems to provide the most plausible reference for the enigmatic statement in 539. This emergence of all bodily forms from the perishing of what has gone before seems to provide the most plausible reference for the enigmatic treatment that death is all things we see awake, the death of all structures and organisms that have yielded to something new. The second part of the phrase, everything we see asleep, refers to the dream experience and thus to a different mode of transformation. In 90, Heraclitus pursues this reflection upon sleep, the twin of death, as a partial revelation of the limitness of the psyche, that deep logos that will not permit us to find the ends of the soul, even if you travel over every path. The description of our psychic experience in terms of quenching and kindling suggests that the soul must have its own mode of exemplifying the cycle of ever-living fire, its own mode of survival and revival, where life and death will somehow alternate like sleeping and walking. Hints of such a view are given here in the play of the hapestai, lightning and grasping, and in other stylistic peculiarities of 90. The first sentence seems to be a straightforward description of lamp lighting at dusk, but there is the dramatic generality of the opening words, anthropos and ephronei, human beings in the night, a most unusual construction in the phrase, strikes haptetai, a light for himself, and an implicit suggestion that some other light is being replaced. Above all, there is the curious wording of apos bestis, apopsis, which literally says that he, the man and not his eyes, has been extinguished like a lamp. The fall of night is thus depicted as a kind of death, a quenching of personal fire. These hints are more fully worked out in the next sentence, where the sense of haptetai shifts from kindless to touches, grasps. Living, he touches the dead in his sleep. It is difficult to see how this can refer to anything but the dream experience of the psyche. In Pindar's phrase, the phantom of life, aionos eidolon, which sleeps when the limbs are active but shows to sleeping man in many dreams, the vision of things not seen by day. Unlike Pindar, Heraclitus refuses to admit a more penetrating psychic life in dreams. In sleep, all we see is sleep. At nightfall, we have lost our contact with the daylight, the fire that is shared. So each one is obliged to strike a light for himself. The experience of nightfall is one of isolation, where the individual in his own person reflects the quenching of diurnal fire. Like the lightning of the lamp, the dream experience is weaker counterpart for the lucid fire of the day. The juxtaposition of 90 and 539 suggests a contrast between this private encounter with the dead in the flickering light of sleep and the more public vision of death that is given in all our waking hours. Waking, literally having awakened, he touches the sleeper with its own form of ring structure. 90 ends by return to the point from which it began its descent into the darker regions of the psyche. How does the waking man grasp the sleeper? Presumably not as one man awake touches another man asleep, but rather by the contact of memory and physical continuity between the awakened sleeper and his own former self in sleep. The riddle lies in the statement itself. The riddle lies less in the statement itself than in its studied parallelism with what it precedes. Why should the waking continuity with the dream self be assimilated to the dream experience of contact with the dead? And why are both experiences presented as formal parallels to the lightning of a lamp at nightfall? We are surrounded by a thicket of riddles, but a pattern begins to emerge, a sequence of psychic stages linked to one another by a thread of quenchings, lightnings, and ending by a cyclic return to the starting point. The failure of ordinary visual experience at nightfall is compensated by the lightning of a lamp. Our waking consciousness is in turn put out in sleep, but we kindle for ourselves a new lamp, and thus make contact with the realm of the dead, a realm which is touched but not entered, since the sleeper is still alive. The final stage, when the sleeper awakes, is a return to the initial daytime state, but now in touch with all that precedes. Every stage but the last one represents an increase of darkness and death over daylight and life, a kind of psychic descent into the underworld. In this respect, the pattern of nighttime sleeping and waking parallels the elemental stages outlined in D36, which represent the death of psyche into inert forms and its rebirth from these elements. Since some parallel to a physical or cosmical cycle is strongly suggested by the terminology of quenching and kindling, there has been a temptation to interpret 90 in elemental terms, as when Kirk speaks of the soul in sleep approaching the completely watery state, which means it's thanatos, or death. But no physical doctrine is stated in 90. There is no clear basis in the fragment for a stage-by-stage correlation of waking and sleeping with the elemental cycle of D36. None of the quotes I mentioned before says anything about a dense destiny of the psyche that rises above its normal waking state, whose vision was equated with death. In this sense, the whole range of ordinary human experience, asleep or awake, can be seen as so many different stages in a cycle of death. Where then is true life to be found? This question can only be answered from other fragments, like 92 and 93 and 109. 111, D75, I would refer to the D versions henceforth. Marcus Aurelius, is a quote from him. Heraclitus says, I think, that men asleep are laborers and co-workers in what takes place in the world. The emperor in his meditation cites from memory without great concern for accuracy. Hence, 111 is at best a free paraphrase, and some editors count it only as a reminiscent of I3. Men are forgetful of what they do asleep. It seems more likely that Marcus Aurelius here, like Plutarch in 6d89, is recalling some statement on the sleeper otherwise lost, so that 111 would form a pendant to 6. In sleep, a man turns away from the common world of the waking, but he is never altogether out of touch. But the indication here is too vague to add anything substantial to our understanding of Heraclitus' conception of sleep. Well, now we'll go to 112, D62. Immortals are mortals, mortals immortal, living the other's death, dead in the other's life. This in point form Heraclitus' masterpiece, the most perfectly symmetrical of all the fragments. The first two clauses of 2 words each, with copula unexpressed in Greek, are mirror images, identical but for the word order A, B, B, A. A third, fourth and fourth clauses involve more complex inversions. To the participle living in the third clause corresponds to the noun life in the fourth, and conversely for death in the former and dead in the latter. The symmetry is again reinforced by chiastic order: participle, noun phrase, participle. The 2-2, 4-4 structure of these 12 words point to some tight pattern of unity between life and death, whose exact content is not easy to make out. The interpretation poses 2 distinct problems. What is Heraclitus' own meaning here? And what is the place of this utterance in the Greek tradition of speculation about the afterlife? It is only the first question which directly concerns us. The second problem will be briefly touched on. The 112 asserts some equivalence between mortals and immortals by an interchange of life and death. It is the mode of interchange that is problematic. As a starting point for literal exegesis, we may assume that mortals and immortals mentioned here are the same as in the usual notion of men and gods, who are distinguished by war in D53, formerly mentioned, since the term men and mortals, gods and immortals, are practically synonymous in Greek. It would be arbitrary to take them otherwise here unless we have some special reason to do so. Hence, on the first interpretation we assign death and dying only to mortal men. The second half of 112 and 92 then says, they, the gods, live our death. We are dead in their life. On this, which I will call the weak reading, there is no reference to the death of the gods. The 40s, we mortal men are immortal in that our death is really a new kind of divine life. They, the gods, are mortal not because they die, because their life is derived from our death. How grand isn't that? A stronger interpretation will reverse the roles of men and gods, as the symmetry of the clauses seems to require. But first we develop the implications of the weaker reading, in which immortals are defined as beings whose life is nourished by our death. What beings are these? The initial reference must be to elemental bodies or powers, water, earth, and the funerary fire, into which our bodies and perhaps our psyches also passes after death, into which our body, but the beings who live from our death should include also new forms of life that spring up from the earth, the grass, the budding plants and the trees, the flowers of Greek autumn and spring, as well as those worms and other animals believed to be born from the soil. Now these beings are themselves mortal, so to pursue this thought will bring us to the second, stronger interpretation, where mortals and immortals change places with one another. In other respects, also the weaker reading pushes us in the same direction. For instance, if the death of mortals is the life of immortals, then the latter will include elemental water, since according to 102 D36, what is death for the human psyche is birth for water. Hence water is one of the immortals who live from our death. But by the same token, water is mortal, since its death is the birth of earth. Or if we think of the death of mortals here in terms of the extinction of nighttime and sleeping in 90 D26, then the immortals will be represented by successive psychic states that come to life as our normal consciousness is quenched in darkness and sleep. Included among these immortals will be the nocturnal psyche and the dead whom we encounter in dreams. So once again we end up with a stronger reading. The immortals turn out to include not only the mortals but the dead. I conclude that no weak reading which preserves the traditional dichotomy between mortals and immortals can stand as a complete interpretation of 112, and a strict equivalence between the two classes is strongly suggested by the formal reversibility of the first four words, where it makes no difference which term we take as subject, which as predicate. If we take the first pair of the terms as affirming that mortals are immortal, the second will affirm that immortals are mortal, and conversely. But it makes no difference which term is subject. Then it makes no difference which term serves an antecedent for the possessive pronoun there, H Kahn, in the two following clauses. The weaker reading construes the two occurrences of this pronoun in two different ways. The immortal gods live our death, the death of mortals, where we mortals are dead in their life, in the life of the gods. On the strong reading, accepting the full equivalence, we reverse the antecedents and have mortals live the death of immortals. Immortals are dead in the life of mortals. For ordinary Greek view of the gods, these claims are extraordinarily shocking, scarcely less so than the contempt which Heraclitus expresses for the ritual regard for the dead. In early poetry and myth, freedom from death is the essential characteristic of gods. Mortality is what separates the human condition from the divine. By asserting the mortality of the gods in 112, Heraclitus breaks completely with the traditional Greek piety. This heretical doctrine finds some curious echoes in literature of the 5th and 4th centuries, as we shall see. But before considering these parallels, we must pursue one step further the interpretation of 112 within the context of Heraclitus' own thought. For a full interpretation, the strong reading requires two theses which reinforces one another, in which may be seen as complementary aspects of a single chain. 1. The reversibility of the process of death by analogy with sleeping and waking, day and night, summer and winter. 2. The complete relativization or generalization of the notion of death, considered as any change of stage in which something old gives way before something drastically new. Hence, it will not be a metaphor to speak of the death of water, for instance in evaporation, or the death of day at nightfall, any more than it is metaphorically to speak of the dying out of spring vegetation in the long drought of Greek summer. Human death, the death of each of us and those dear to us, will have to be understood as phenomena of precisely the same sort, a change of state within the total life cycle of nature. This thought will be developed in 113. Since we may now note some historical parallels to this paradoxical view, since the basic axiom of traditional Greek piety is that the gods are immortal, to speak of the death is the gravest sort of blasphemy. In the case of the one god Dionysus, whose death was recounted in the myth of the classical period, the evidence is too obscure and complicated to be discussed here. What is clear is that Herodotus, when he refers to a comparable Egyptian myth concerning Osiris, whom he identified with Dionysus, is always careful to hedge his report with something like mystical silence. Who is there to mourn on this occasion? It is not Pius, Hosion, for me to say. But if to speak of the death of a single god is an act of sacrilege, what are we to say of the general pronouncement that immortals are immortal? As Wilamowitz observed, at Athens Heraclitus would have been put to death for impiety. I do not know of any true parallel in the classical period to this insistence upon the mortality of the immortals. Empedocles does speak of powers swiftly growing mortal, Thneta, which had previously learned to be immortal, Athanata. Empedocles may be echoing Heraclitus, but this contest is cosmogonic and allegorical. He is referring to the formation of mortal compounds from the combination of elemental principles under the influence of love. Thus, although there is a genuine affinity of doctrine, the esoteric verses of Empedocles have nothing like the provocative force of 112. It seems unlikely that any pious Greek was scandalized by this passage. On the other hand, the converse assertion that mortal can become God is announced by Empedocles in another poem. His katharmoi, or purifications, in terms that must have been regarded as provocative. I greet you, I, an immortal God, mortal no longer. To find a parallel to this extraordinary pronouncement in classical period, we must look to the mystic promise preserved on 2 of the gold tablets from Turi in South Italy, buried with a body in the grave. Fortunate and most blessed, you will be a god instead of a mortal. I think this is wildly interesting. It shows that in Western development we do not take these insights to heart, and we get stranded in a non-understanding of language and world. And the physis does its job, which Heraclitus, I'll come to later lectures, points to already then. Once physis is established, we have this absolute standstill mentally, and we have only death. And we cling to life, and I would say life in the modern man is the metaphysics of presence. We have neither life nor death, since we have not understand what Heraclitus is meant. And this has also led me to take a new turn on Sanskrit words. I realized they have all been misunderstood in the West, because since Heraclitus some clumsiness was established, and misreading of all the Indian terms has made the access to Indian thinking inaccessible. Well, sorry. Oh. Why, maybe a third point, this can also lead us to athanatos, something that we lost with Heraclitus, because not accepting death makes life impossible. And then we have this substitute, supplement we never can reach, which is the metaphysics of presence. And this is actually how Indian philosophy is 100% perceived by Western thinkers. I was lucky to find a book I will take up later, written by Rajiv Mahorit, and he writes that every single concept coming from the Sanskrit has been misunderstood. And so it is good, because that means it is a text already poisoned. It has poisonous tablets within itself. Reincarnation and karma being 2 of those things. They destroy the thinking, make it impossible to accept or take in our own system. And thereby it will be like a cyst. A cyst is part of the body that has been encapsulated, not taken to the body, not being part of the body. It doesn't have a blood flow, nothing like that. It just have fluid. So all philosophy, including Indian thinking, has become a cyst. It doesn't participate in our regular thinking. And Heraclitus is actually showing very, very clearly to that point, which makes him grand. In full admiration, I will at least point to the beloved Ionia of Heraclitus. It's beyond there somewhere, maybe 500 kilometers or 500 miles. But there it is, his beloved Ionia, and this is where the dwellers of this little village come from originally. And I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon.